Hello, everybody, and welcome to the launch event of our AI and procurement primer. Thank you so much for joining us today on this warm summer day at the end of June in 21. My name is Sloane. I'm a sociologist based at New York University. I'm also a senior research scientist at the NYU Center for Responsible AI. And I had the pleasure of running the AI and procurement project together with the wonderful Dr. Rumman Chowdhury, who is now leading all things responsible technology and AI at Twitter, as well as with John C. Havens, who is running ethical AI at the IEEE. We also had a wonderful group of roundtable panelists who I'll be talking about in a little bit, who also participated, who I'm very grateful for giving their time. We had help from Tomo Lazovic at Twitter in putting this primer together, from Luis Rincon Alba, Kayla Krieger, Melissa Lucas Ludwig, and also Janina Zakshevsky, who has played a pivotal role in pulling this all together over the last 2 weeks. So a lot of gratitude towards everybody who has been on this journey with us. Now, the AI procurement project was a set of roundtables that we held in 2021, which brought together leading experts in the public sector, data science, civil society, policy, social science, and law, so that we could generate a more structured understanding of existing public procurement processes, and also understand and map out how we can use those and leverage those to mitigate risks that can be posed by AI system and support and protect community needs. We had wonderful conversations, 3 in total. We looked at mapping data science solutions that are used by public institutions to understand the field. We looked at algorithmic justice and responsible AI, and we tried to wrap our head around governance, innovation, and procurement. What we want to do with this project, and what's been the spirit of this project, is setting or putting infrastructure in place so that more equitable conversations can be had around procurement and artificial intelligence, and so that we can innovate from the bottom up. So the spirit is very much community building. And in that spirit, the primer that you can download on our project website, which we will put in the chat shortly, should also be read. It is not sort of a top-down prescription of here's what you should do. Rather, it maps out tension points and narrative traps and 4 calls for action, so that individual institutions, agencies, organizations, and communities can map their contextual way forward when it comes to innovating AI and procurement. So in that sense, it's very much a toolkit. Now, just very briefly, what does AI have to do with procurement? Essentially, I think it is fair to say that the COVID-19 pandemic has really underlined how biases can manifest in many different aspects of public use technology. For example, federal COVID-19 funding allocations algorithms have favored high-income communities over low-income communities due to historical biases that are prevalent in training data. Artificial intelligence solutions, and we'll get to what that means in a second, in their role as public use technologies, can be implemented fast and are typically provided by private companies. Now, as more and more aspects of public service are infused with AI systems and other technologies provided by private companies, we are actually seeing a growing network of privately owned infrastructure. And unlike private companies, which have a responsibility to serve their shareholders and to generate profit, public entities must consider their entire population when delivering a solution, and are tasked with mitigating harms that are introduced by AI communities. Essentially, there are 2 problems we'd say that persist. 1, AI public use is different. The public use of algorithmic decision-making systems has different requirements than a private use product. While there is an expectation that a technology built for public use is able to address the needs of all citizens, it is not necessarily the expectation of privately built products. In fact, many products are targeted specifically for a particular audience and later generalized to a broader user group. This gap is really rarely considered. Then second, public use has higher compliance standards. Public use technologies are subject to different compliance and legal criteria than most private use technologies. In New Orleans, the undisclosed use of Palantir's Gotham platform was argued to be in violation of Brady versus Maryland, a Supreme Court case that places a responsibility on prosecutors to disclose any information that could cast doubt on any evidence presented against the accused. For Cantrell Hickerson, who received a prison sentence related to gang involvement, the use of Gotham was not disclosed to his lawyers, allowing him to petition for a new trial, although it was not granted. In other cases, the use of algorithmic decision-making systems has been in violation of due process law, in particular the use of allocative algorithms to determine Medicare and Medicaid benefits. So we see there's lots to do here. Just very briefly, we want to define artificial intelligence. We know that this is a kind of hot topic, but essentially what we mean by artificial intelligence are automated decision systems, or ADS. And these systems, and I'm quoting Rashida Richardson, are any systems, software, or process that use computation to aid or replace government decisions, judgment, and/or policy implementation that impact opportunities, access, liberties, rights, and/or safety. And this is from Rashida Richardson's new paper, Defining and Demystifying Automated Decision Systems, which we highly recommend. We also want to define public procurement. For our purposes, we kind of say that public procurement is the designated legal authority to advise, plan, obtain, deliver, and evaluate a government's expenditures on goods and services that are used to fulfill stated objectives, obligations, and activities in pursuit of desired policy outcomes. There are typically 6 stages in procurement: defining a need, writing a request for proposals, RFP, bid solicitation, vendor selection, contracting, and execution. It's important to note that this process is continually changing and evolving, especially when there are high pressure situations such as a global health emergency. And we may also want to add that the initiation of the RFP does not necessarily always come from a public agency. Agencies may have difficulties clearly articulating their need, and vendors or private consultants can then enter the conversation and shape the framing of the need or the problem that needs to be solved. So we're now coming to the meaty part of our project. We identified 6 tension points that emerge in the context of AI and procurement. And the first one is a very basic one, in that we have a problem around definitions. There is no agreed upon notion of artificial intelligence or even an algorithm. And there are not necessarily clearly defined legal frameworks and principles that articulated as they pertain to artificial intelligence. This becomes particularly sticky when it comes to justice. There are different notions of what constitutes justice in the context of AI, and we're very much in the conversation in terms of finding out what that means. And in order to arrive at a workable definition of justice that indeed is just, it is necessary to include those who are affected by AI injustice. And then metrics is another important one, particularly metrics of success for both the AI system as well as the process through which it was procured. If there is an absence of appropriate metrics of success, then we can also end up in situations where these metrics are continually changing, which means the goalposts are being moved, or where these metrics of success can be conflicting. Process is another important tension point. The procurement process as such has actually been designed to prevent abuse, but essentially the result is that it has solidified sets of procedures that tend to only allow large vendors to meet standards and compete for government contracts. Long-term contracts that result from these sets of procedures can lock in government agencies over years and can create path dependencies. These can also spill over into newly emerging spaces such as algorithmic auditing, where large vendors, which already have contracts with government agencies, then add algorithmic auditing into their service portfolio, which then can incentivize government agencies to contract these services through their existing vendors, which brings into question things like independent auditing. Incentives is another one. The primary responsibility, and we talked about this briefly, of most vendors is towards their shareholders, not necessarily clients or the people who use their services and systems, which means the current procedural and cultural setup of procurement are propped up by incentive structures that are not conducive to measures that would protect the public or mitigate algorithmic harm, not least because these could potentially slow down the procurement process. Institutional structures is another tension point, whereby institutional structures of government can challenge procurement innovation to account for the specifics of AI systems, particularly when it comes to the timeframe of solving problems and achieving innovation. Government policies are generally constructed with a 10-year timeframe. This is input from DJ Patil, who was the chief data scientist in the Obama administration. We also need to know that policymakers seek to create impact within their much shorter tenure, often with a view for re-election. Industry is moving even faster. Policymakers and industry speeds can converge when decision makers are confronted with having to solve issues within their tenure, which does not necessarily align with the organizational priorities and timeframes of a government. So there's actually multiple tension points in this tension point. Technology infrastructures is another tension point. We just alluded to the fact that procurement is a gateway for building infrastructure and building technology infrastructure. And this has long-term effects on cities, communities, and on the agencies themselves. Due to the lack of capacity or resources to build technology in-house, procurement invites the building of large-scale technology infrastructures that include artificial intelligence through private vendors. This can prevent instead of foster transparency. This is something that's debated in the community a lot. We see protections through trade law, and private vendors are not necessarily obligated to open up the black box and share insight into things such as training data or models. Liabilities is another one. Liabilities is essentially a very complex and emergent topic that is increasingly addressed in the international community. There are very few legislative safeguards at the moment that protect from the evolving discriminatory impacts of AI systems, such as the violation of human rights or anti-discrimination law, even though we've seen a decided move on behalf of the European Commission, who has focused on that recently. Even when public agencies are subject to legal obligations covering AI or other technologies, these obligations are not necessarily considered by private companies in the design and testing of a technology product for the use in the public sector. Rather, companies tend to use spaces with little citizen and public sector protection as liability-free test grounds. The labs are sort of shipped offshore. And then these technologies come back and are, they were developed in liability free or liability low spaces and are then deployed here. I want to move us on to another big part of our work, which are the 5 narrative traps that we have developed. And the reason why narrative traps are important is because narratives, which are essentially assemblages of images, stories, histories, very much shape how we envision futures, which shapes how policy is made. And we identified 5 ones that are particularly important to acknowledge and address in the context of AI procurement. How you address those is in the primer, and we hopefully talk a little bit more about that in the panel discussion, but here they are. The first one is we quote unquote must engage the public, which is a narrative trap because it deliberately diffuses what engagement means. Does engagement refer to the democratic process, citizen participation in administrative decision-making, public oversight, all of them, none of that? And so a lack of defining engagement means that communities will find it difficult to demand it. Also, this narrative leaves unclear what the public means and ignores those communities or ignores that there are communities who have historically been excluded from that frame. which is a good cue for the second narrative trap. So monolithic framings of key terms such as the public, government, bias, and algorithm tend to exclude nuance, and they derive from dominance in the public discourse, which upholds historic power structures. For example, historically, the term the public did not include communities of color, and government did not mean indigenous government. So if we continue with the use of these terms without nuance and historic context, we will continue exclusion. Similarly, calls for simplification can function as incubators for new narrative traps because they generally set the expectation that generalization over nuance is the key to successful technology design and policy process. For example, a call for generalizing bias can actually cause terms like harm or impact to be generalized to a degree that they are removed from the actual lived experience of individuals. Third narrative trap is that the main threat is the government use of data. That this threat is bigger than the potential private use of data. And we do think that this is a fallacy. In many contexts, governments or government agencies do not possess data archives of the same size as industry. They don't have the capacity to collect, clean, or analyze that data. And they may have stricter rules for that collection and processing of data, which limits their ability to use data effectively when it would actually be needed. Narratives that suggest the opposite are trapped because they divert regulatory attention and scrutiny away from private companies. One incentive shared across all actors can initiate change. This is a narrative trap because it implies that a silver bullet approach can serve as a solution for a very complex and emerging problems that occur in the context of AI and procurement. It also perpetuates the idea that goal alignment and compliance can be achieved through introducing a shared incentive, for example, avoid fines, which is a strategy that ignores that there are larger systems of capitalist or bureaucratic incentives that play for different actors that may override any single incentives. If we're thinking about fines that have been imposed by the European Commission, we know that these are actually pocket money for some big tech corporates. And this last narrative trap, we can create change in AI design and deployment through procurement alone. That's a narrative trap that we kind of set up as a mirror for our own work and as we set out to build community around AI and procurement. And we kind of want to make very explicit that we do not want to fall into that trap. Similarly to the other narrative traps, postulating that there is a silver bullet solution, especially related to mitigating issues of AI harms and government use of AI systems, is not necessarily realistic. And it also ignores the fundamental fact that it is exceptionally difficult to change and improve the procurement process iteratively in order to address the emergent nature of AI risk. The last part are our four calls for action. The first one is that we would say that the thing that we can do immediately is start thinking about how we can redefine the process so that we can generate structured and meaningful and careful considerations of the impact of AI systems in a time frame that makes sense for any given procurement process. There needs to be ample time to define and document the problem that the AI system should address and how it should address it. Affected communities must be heard, and new AI legislation on both national and international levels, we're seeing a lot of movement here, must be absorbed and effectively translated into change in AI design, procurement, and use. So we need to redefine the process to create space for that. We also need to create meaningful transparency. There's a need to improve communication and issue presentation of AI systems and the risk and harms they can pose. Procurement officers, policymakers, citizens, and vendors must gain a better understanding of how individual situations of AI harm and risk connect to bigger structural problems and vice versa. We're talking about literacy here and how it's connected to transparency. So in order to create meaningful transparency standards for the communication of the goals and assumptions baked into an AI system, as well as the AI risks and harms the system can pose, should be established alongside guidelines for the documentation and record keeping of such communication, which links us to kind of transparency being an interdisciplinary problem. These kinds of record keeping and translation problems are very familiar to people who work in library science, for example. The next one is build a network. There is a real need for interagency communication as well as exchange and capacity building on issues related to procurement of AI systems. There's also a need to more clearly define intra-agency responsibilities for the procurement of AI systems and the impact they can have on citizens. We need to deploy resources to support these professional communities within agencies who are working toward improving procurement processes. And similarly, we need to mobilize resources and assistance for communities outside of agencies who are actually the ones who are surfacing issues of AI harms. And we should make these available. And lastly, and very importantly, we need to cultivate talent. And this is a call for action that is very dear to my heart, and I'm sure many others who are working with young people every day. The field of public interest technology is growing significantly and rapidly. Government agencies are increasingly using technologies across all aspects of their work. There's a growing need for people who do that work, professionals who are trained in both technical and social science fields that are able to adequately assess the social implications of technology as they continually emerge. Luckily, there is a growing desire among the next generation who are very keen to do this work and who are very much waiting for us to create these kinds of positions and reward them with sort of very clear career paths. And that brings me to the end of my part of today's launch. I want to ask you all to join the community to innovate artificial intelligence procurement. We have a new website that we will put into the chat where you can sign up for a Google group, which is essentially a listserv where we can share news and resources and share ideas. You can also get involved with the IEEE and John C. Havens, who is leading new work on the development of a standard, which is a great cue for me to call in Alpesh Shah, who's gonna say a few words about the work of IEEE.
Hi everyone, and thank you, Mona. What a wonderful summary and amazing work that you and the community have pulled together here. And I couldn't agree with it more. You know, the IEEE is a large entity with over 400,000 members across 160 plus countries. And the work that we've been seeing in the field of AI, but also in the work of sustainability and digital resiliency have much in common, especially when we think about this point of procurement. And so what I'd like to do is just share a few of the efforts that we have that tie back to what Mona shared here, and I think very, very relevantly so, such as the points that she noted about when it comes to procurement, that it's not sort of the end-all be-all silver bullet. And so as we look at much of this, whether short-term or long-term, as cities are planning about their long-term plans and thinking about long-term implications, having addressing the solutions, as noted by Mona, are very critical. And as we think about AI systems governance, for example, our P2863 work, or our work on socio-technical measures with our wellness work on IEEE 7010, and even work that emanated as a result of these great workshops that Mona had pulled together with regards to work around recommended practices for provenance of indigenous people's data. These are all critical elements that the IEEE is happy to support as a standardization body. And at the same time, when and where there's interest in building sustainable standards in this space, please feel free to reach out, as Mona has indicated, to John Havens, or check out the website at aiprocurement.wordpress.com. The last point I just wanted to add here is that much of what has been outlined by Mona and the team, and what is outlined in the workshop report are so critical in terms of our future path when we think about the implications not only of the technology itself, but its implications on two critical aspects of our future. The first is children, and the second is the climate. So I hope you see the great work done here as very much a building block towards scaling the change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alpesh. I will take it over from here. Thank you, Mona, for the very thoughtful explanation. As you can tell, that is quite an in-depth document. And as Mona explained, it was a project that was born of multiple workshops and a desire to bring together the different kinds of stakeholders that are engaged and involved in influencing the AI procurement process in some way or another. So I'm very thrilled to be introducing our discussion panel, Adrianna, Deirdre, Mulligan, and Fabian Rogers. So the reason we have invited these three people is Mona and I felt like they were a great cross-sectional representation of the kinds of people we wanted at our event. And as Mona suggested, one of the narrative traps is to flatten people or institutions or groups into one short definition. So for the next 15 minutes, 20 minutes, we're going to just be chatting about the workshops. I will mention that all of these people were not necessarily in the same workshop. So there's a couple of goals for this discussion. One is for actually some of these folks to start interacting with each other outside of their workshop groups and to see how a narrative may have carried or have been conducted a little bit differently. We did have different goals and outcomes for each of the workshops, and also to learn a little bit about what these individuals took away and what they hope their counterparts can take away. So first, I would like to ask each of the panelists to introduce yourself and one takeaway you had from your workshop, and I'll start with Adrianna.
Hi, I'm the Director of Product Management at San Francisco Digital Services, which is a digital team embedded in the local city government. So I almost didn't agree to be involved in all of this because I found the premise that I as a single individual could impact the procurement process extremely funny. And I think that ties into the whole narrative trap that we had around how there are actually, there are very few incentives to change and define the procurement process. And so I think it's important to continue being in these things and to continue discussing with other agencies and people from different backgrounds to try to see how we can help to discuss and define the guidelines further at this really important topic.
Thank you, Deirdre.
Hi, thank you so much, both for the work and for including me in the workshops and this launch event. Congratulations. I'm Deirdre Mulligan. I'm a professor at the School of Information at Berkeley, and I also have an appointment at the law school, so I'm a lawyer by training. I think one of the kind of perennial issues in this space is the need for what I like to refer to as boundary objects. Mona talked about the need to help people talk about an issue like justice, right? And when we think about issues of fairness or issues of privacy, we often realize that different communities are using that term in very different ways. And many of the definitions that are kind of essential policy questions that are reflected in these systems are things that people don't have a lot of practice talking across boundaries about. And so I think there's a lot of scaffolding that we need to do, and that certainly can occur in places, I think, like 18F, US Digital Services, IEEE, other places. But I also think that there's academic work that needs to continue to happen to try to test out different ways to foster those conversations through tools. And so I think one of the things that I really took away from the workshop was the need for those boundary objects. And it's both the people that Mona spoke about, right? We need these public interest technologists that have kind of the interdisciplinary training and the capacity to speak across boundaries because they have a foot in each one. But we also need to kind of develop a richer toolkit and set of methodologies to support that work. And I think that the workshops and this document really help continue to point us in that direction. So thank you for it.
Thank you, Deirdre. And Fabian.
Hey everybody, thanks all for having me on. My name is Fabian Rogers. I'm currently a constituent advocate in Senator Jabari Brisport's office out here in Senate District 25 of Brooklyn, New York, but I didn't come into this space through that capacity. I'm sort of one of the representations from, I think, what is it you call like, from like the 4 calls of like action. I come from like one of the impacted communities that dealt with like facial recognition and housing in particular, private housing or affordable housing really. And so from that work I did from years ago with Atlantic Towers and just being a resident who was just curious on how to fix their situation, it ended up being a thing where the conversation on what ethics, what practice, what deployment, what ethical deployment, what ethical like innovation and things like that looks like. It ended up involving me as well as many other colleagues from Atlantic to be in these types of conversations and offer the other perspective of the folks that have to deal with technology from a perspective of they're not interested in the innovation, they have technology being imposed on their lifestyle. So now what does that relationship look like? When you have someone that's not adamant necessarily about technology, but it's being imposed on their lifestyle, how does that change up the relationship and how we're talking about technology? And are all the ethics there in place? And so these are really helpful conversations in terms of filtering that out and figuring out how to deal with not just the developers and the deployers, but dealing with the impacted communities as well and trying to build a full cycle process of dealing with AI, which I think has been a conversation that's been trying to develop as the years have gone on. But it's just to make it feasible and something tangible for folks that come from impacted communities that aren't as versed in the terminology, but making it accessible to them. I think that's been the hurdle that we've been dealing with for a long time. So it's great to have another space to add that's building that sort of accessibility for betterment overall. So I'm super happy to be a part of this.
Great, thank you. And I want to pull on a thread that I think Adrianna started and then was also continued through Deirdre and Fabian's words. And this idea that, no one body or group or organization is empowered to really influence the process. It is a process, it is a multi-institutional process, it is a multi-actor process. It actually occurs within multiple layers of government, some of which are interdependent, some of which have relativistic power dynamics. So how does one even begin to entangle? And again, I want to emphasize that like each of the 3 of you represent a different stakeholder embedded in a different institution. It seems like it's a common thing that everyone seems to be saying. So is it hopeless for us to even try to wrap our heads around this? Where maybe from your perspectives are the different points at which somebody who is in your shoes can start poking and prodding? And maybe I'll start with you, Adrianna.
Yeah, so on a practical level, when I'm asked to fill out various documentation for things like, software that I want to buy and things I want to procure, I very often have to fill out, well, is there a PII that's going to be collected as the health information? What is the security standard? So it would be great if at some point in the future we could think about there being an additional thing. I mean, it would be one more thing for me to fill out, but I think it's important. Like, what is the potential harm of this? And maybe that's something that we can formalize and work on in the coming years, probably.
Deirdre, any thoughts on your end, especially as a representative of, I suppose, in this forum, academic institutions?
So I have a few thoughts. In parallel to this process, to some extent, I was also involved with some process at the Administrative Conference of the United States, which is an independent federal agency that's charged with convening expert representatives from the public and private sectors to recommend improvements to administrative process and procedure. And they produced a statement on agency, so federal agency, right, use of artificial intelligence in December. And I think it's would be very useful to bring statements like these into conversation with one another. And the reason I think that would be a useful step forward is I think that there are, one, we want to avoid, right, we want to let 1,000 flowers bloom because we hope that there'll be innovation in that. But I think we're also looking to try to leverage everybody's particular expertise. And I think if we create a little bit more community as people have generated these documents from their perspective, right? And so the ACUS document, right, is talking about the ways in which artificial intelligence is changing government agency work, and both looking at some of the potential benefits, but also being really aware of the ways in which AI might displace human decision making and discretion, which is kind of the essential reason that we have administrative agencies to begin with, and the ways in which, as your report flags, some of the technical choices about, for example, like what is the construct we're trying to predict, right? How are we going to encode something? Are actually policy choices that shouldn't be left for the vendor to determine, right? But how do we make sure that agencies understand that there are policies being set in these systems and that those things need to be treated the way in which administrative law, for example, right, requires? They have to be kind of subject to real expert input, to public participation, etc. But I think we need to kind of pull these communities together so that we can figure out like who needs to build what and kind of where the hooks are. So to me, I think that's a kind of way that we might think about moving forward.
That's great. And Fabian, you had already started talking about this notion of different quote unquote publics, particularly as impacted communities, and how your role has shifted. What are your thoughts on what Deirdre has said in terms of like tying in together different perspectives from different communities? And how do you think, folks can be involved? So again, we're going to go back to this concept of the public or the publics. I know I get asked that question all the time, and it's always a really hard one to answer. How would you suggest?
Yeah, so for me, how I look at it is like this sort of space in regards to Deirdre's last comments, the idea of basically making a more accountable system on a legal level is like super important. Because what we've seen in the past is there has been legislation that's tried to approach the subject of facial recognition or AI technology in different facets, just because of how facial recognition became like a booming subject to have to deal with. But the problem was being that things were being cranked out without the necessary oversight to really allow for true efficacy in law. And rather now you have a lot of legislators or elected officials that are just like, hey, I'm on top of this, but like, what's the efficacy of the legislation really? And so, the points that Deirdre brings up is super important in the fact that it kind of, it makes an interwoven fabric of bringing about the concerns that actually come from impacted communities, and then bringing about the proper sort of standards from that of accountability that would have to be imposed on vendors, developers, and things like that, that are circumventing that just because AI, facial recognition, biometric technology, they're all being developed and deployed in a sort of cesspool kind of fashion where there's no really checks and balances in terms of what's the impacts of this technology? How does it affect the impacted communities? Do the impacted communities have a stake in what's being imposed on them? What's the risk of harm that comes with that? Are there legal threats that come with that? Are there liabilities that come with all that? And having that sort of consideration by including impacted communities' perspective, whether it's through like having an earnest conversation and not just having like, you know, interviews to try to get a news scoop, but really having an in-depth conversation with impacted communities for the people who are willing to have that conversation. Because understand, when you're talking to impacted communities, the perspective can be different. You'll be talking to people that aren't impassioned by technology. They aren't impassioned by AI technology. They aren't impassioned by facial recognition, and that's no fault of their own. They're just having a lifestyle that's having these things imposed on them. So it's a much more different sort of mindset. And so having the patience to speak with the communities impacted, really let them be able to give all their sort of concerns out and list them to bring into consideration when it comes to thinking about what does legal liabilities look like, what does legislative liabilities look like, what does this look like on a legislative level if we were to write this into law, and does this have efficacy to the groups that we talk to in the first place? Does this have efficacy to protect the folks that were making concerns about this in the first place? Does this touch base at home at we're protecting the folks that were impacted in the first place, and we're negating any sort of future manipulations by the authorities that tried to deploy this stuff in the first place? So it's a two-pronged sort of accountability sort of mind frame that you have to have, which involves a lot of patience and a lot of just information gathering and aggregate data gathering through people and their sort of perspectives to try to get at a proper solution. So it gets more complicated, but to get the results that you want, it takes a while. And I think that's what's been missing when we look at past legislation that's tried to approach this problem. Folks are trying to be like, oh, let's try to fix this now. And that it just doesn't work that way. And that's why you've had Swiss cheese efficacy with past legislation.
So one common theme in all of the workshops is this notion of communication, whether it's literally even interdepartmental within government, or taking a narrative from one group and explaining it to another. But in your workshop, Fabian, the one that was with a lot of folks who are community organizers thinking about justice frameworks, my galaxy brain moment was the whole discussion we all had about how when individuals bring things to politicians and trying to raise issues, it's very episodic and it's very specific. So it's saying, my landlord wants to put in facial recognition cameras. The narratives that tend to speak to policymakers and especially the higher up you go in the food chain are not episodic, they're thematic. So it is not, my apartment building is installing facial recognition cameras. It's that apartment buildings are installing facial recognition cameras. This is being given to the police. It's being used in a particular way. But is that, and I think you had really, it was a very passionate plea that you had. And I thought that was a very brilliant takeaway. How might you suggest that individuals trying to communicate these issues upwards, or, I mean, I think you've just given a really good case for how policymakers higher up need to better understand what individuals are trying to communicate. How might you suggest to a community activist group, a community organizer, how to best communicate their challenges upwards to really influence policy at broad scale? And just one more point that, and I think you had made, and again, was really critical to my understanding, was that, because what happens is that in good intent, a policymaker will solve the problem being presented to them, which is my apartment building is installing facial recognition cameras, and think they're done, good, problem solved, let's go home. When it actually is an endemic, a growing or a creeping problem, and that has not been understood. So what are the suggestions you have for folks who were in the shoes you were in a few years ago?
I think it's getting creative on understanding how interwoven this problem can be, thinking about the different contexts at which, when we're talking about technology, it's just like, where else do you see technology possibly being a problem, and seeing how you could almost involve other communities or other organizations, just because even though AI is becoming an uprising sort of topic of interest for folks to get involved with, it's still a niche sort of subject in itself, and lawmakers feel like it can be difficult to gauge how to approach the problem. So I kind of think of it as like, okay, well, what's actively out here that approaches other forms of policing or surveillance? how do we then extend what that is to then cover this sort of aspect of the trenches? And so that becomes a conversation in terms of collaborating impacted communities with either like nonprofit organizations that have been a part of those lobbying discussions, to then have them be able to verbalize the proper legalese if, you know, impacted communities can't. I feel like oftentimes it'll be regular everyday people that don't know how to verbalize this in legalese and legislation. I might be assuming, and again, that can make an ass out of you and me, so I apologize, but I'm just kind of thinking, you know, first, straightforward, having impacted communities collaborate with nonprofit organizations that already do that sort of lobbying work, to have them then be able to verbalize what impacted communities can't say to the full breadth, to make the legislation much more expansive and much more impactful than something that's just Swiss cheese and efficacy and doesn't really end up being a part of the budgeting discussion to then make this thing be enforced. So now it's just signed in law, and now it just sits in the legislature or whatever the case may be. And so it's a matter of being able to filter out the thoughts that come from impacted communities, being able to put that in the legalese that can make its way to legislation, and either make it an extension of current legislation on the table that addresses other forms of policing or surveillance, and then add it to that sort of umbrella. So then this doesn't become a thing of, oh, this is new technology, but rather we're thinking about this as, oh, this is a new pest in housing harassment or police harassment or policing or surveillance, and things like that. And that makes, I feel, I can't speak for everyone, but I feel that makes the issue much more tangible, and not make it something that it's just this thing that's in the technology umbrella. Rather, we're bringing it home because it's relatable, just as stop and frisk is to certain communities and things like that.
I think if there's one thing I'm taking away from your narrative, it's that, you know, these problems are not new problems, they're not new issues, they are issues that have existed, and we need to frame these in the narratives of the already existing struggles, because really what the technology is doing is, you know, bringing in a new aspect to it. And I think that was also a theme throughout. So we are running short on time. There's some really great questions in the Q&A, but before we do, I wanted to ask each of the panelists, like, what was one thing that was surprising for you to hear, that you heard at your workshop, or maybe in the conversation today, or maybe in your review of the primer, that you found a little unexpected? I want to start with you, Adrianna.
Yeah, so I haven't been in government for very long. I was always working in the private sector and technology. And so, you know, being there, you often hear that government use of data, public use of data is like the worst, right? And so throughout the workshops and findings of this report, it was interesting to see that, well, there are like guardrails, and that certainly syncs with like the work that I've done as well. So for example, in a lot of like our work to counter the pandemic, I've very often been in conversations where we go, okay, we're sunsetting this thing and we're deleting all data, and you know, nobody can keep it. And so stuff like that is really essential, but also I wonder if it's just a one-off thing because the team or the environment that I work in is very conscious of like how data could be used against minorities and against like, you know, immigrants, for example. So it's left me wondering, well, how can we expand those guardrails, and how can we do more, really? So that was a great fodder.
Great, thank you. And Fabian, what was one thing you found surprising?
I guess it was the sort of silver bullet solution. It's just crazy to realize that when you're talking about very complex problems that are like societal based, there's always this like instinct to try to make a solve it all, a multi-purpose cleaner solution sort of thing. So everyone wants to find their Pine Sol or their like Windex or Kleenex or whatever solution to things. And there's always going to be leftover bacteria when you deal with those types of processes, you know? So for me, it was just like, it's cool that we're having this conversation around let's not look for a silver bullet and let's dig deeper. Let's talk. Let's really get through the major sort of issues that really are uncomfortable because of the massive accountability and information you need in order to fully get the full breadth of what's happening here. And again, it makes the process a bit more difficult, but it's more rewarding in the ethics side of things.
Absolutely. And Deirdre, your thoughts and one thing that you found surprising.
Um, I don't think I was like completely surprised by it, but I think the kind of maybe the public participation. I think that many people talk about it, right? We talk about it in administrative law, we talk about it in system design, and this need to develop, and I think Fabian was talking about this really in a very clear way, the need to engage people in conversations, not around technology, but around the thing it's going to do in somebody's life, the difference it's going to make, the impact it's going to have. And so often when we think about public participation, there's this real emphasis like, how do we get people to understand the technology? And I think Fabian's point is people don't need to exactly understand the inner workings of the technology to understand the way in which it might meaningfully impact their lives in positive and negative ways. And we may need to provide some public interest technologists, some people who can help folks understand enough about the technology or translate enough about their interests into a way that technical people can hear them. But the assumption that kind of public participation depends upon everyone developing a certain level of technical literacy, I think is, it's like this techno-solutionism, technocentrism, and I think that the workshops pushed back on that. And I think Fabian did a really nice job in this conversation talking about like, no, I'm pretty good at articulating my needs and my interests here. It's that sometimes public participation tries to force me to kind of speak in a certain way or constrain the terms of debate around technology in a way that really isn't useful when we're really concerned about impact. And I think that was important. And I wasn't surprised to see it come through, but I think it really is like constantly needs to be emphasized.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you to all of the panelists, and I will move it back to Mona for to kick off the Q&A.
Yes, for me also a big thank you for this great conversation, which gives you a little bit of a taste of the great conversations that we had in the spaces that we created for the roundtables. And I'm just going to start with a very brief question, Adrianna. I think that's maybe a good one for you, which is from Brian, who's asking, at least at the federal level, would it be beneficial if an organization such as NIST set a definition of AI that the USG could or would use during procurement? Big question, do we need one definition of AI for this to work?
I mean, I agree it'd be great, but I also wonder how long it would take to trickle down to the many forms of government that we've got, and certainly like how long it would take to reach like all counties. I'm thinking that's a time horizon of like at least a decade. So I would be interested to see what we can do in that interim before there's a common definition.
Yeah, and also what kinds of spaces we need to create for that to happen. And what I'm interested in always is what role can and must the Academy play here also as an institution that can provide resources and expertise to different kinds of communities of practice. I have another question, which I think is a great one for Fabian from Ben, who's asking, are there any specific strategies how we should go about building capacity for this patient work-intensive labor of cross-sector communication, collaboration, constituent conversations, impact and harm assessment, etc.? Is it just about funding, creating new kinds of positions, developing standards?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. I think it's a mix, it's a myriad of those things. I might come off harsh in this, but it's just like when you want to hear from impacted communities, you have to be mindful that they've had other things going on in their life too. So if you want to involve folks in these sort of, in these conversations, I think it'd be fair enough to say that you should pay them for their time. You should pay them for the insight that you cannot find from anywhere else, but from their perspective. And so if the information that they're sharing is so important that you have to involve them in these types of conversations, pay them for their time. If you feel or if companies are short on what they're providing in terms of having a full breadth idea on how to make things better in terms of AI and facial recognition, when you're going about those job positions, include the folks that are from impacted communities, or at least bring them on as a consultant. At the end of the day, when it comes to involving impacted communities, there should be a form of funding involved in terms of folks sacrificing their time to then synthesize their own sort of traumatic experiences to then try to make golden nuggets of knowledge and insight to then build systems that are more accountable than what came before. So if folks are that valuable that they can change the trajectory of the conversation, I think they should be paid as such. And so definitely a myriad of the things that Ben had brought up for sure.
Thank you, Fabian. Yeah, and that kind of changes how we think about what kinds of budgets we need to allocate to procurement, right? Which is a very concrete step we can kind of take immediately. Deirdre, I have a question for you from David Rubenstein, who deserves a shout out because he gave terrific feedback also on the primer, who is saying that he's embarking on a research project focused on federal, state, or federalism opportunities and challenges, including in regards to procurement and funding relationships. For example, states and cities procuring AI systems or services through US government procurement vehicles and federal grants to states and cities that in turn use the funds to procure AI systems. I'm wondering if you have any insights, anecdotes, or resources you'd be willing to share, because I know, Deirdre, you've been working on procurement for a couple of years now.
So one of the areas that I first started looking at the procurement issue was around things like facial recognition, the introduction of kind of large scale public video surveillance systems. And those were largely being funded by block grants post 9/11 from, the Department of Homeland Security. And there was quite a long effort, and people might be interested to go and look at all of the hearings and workshops that happened at the Department of Homeland Security through their privacy office. And there were a lot of conversations about how to make sure that, for example, just privacy impact assessments flowed down. And I spent quite a bit of time trying to get the then general counsel at DHS to include a provision, right? Because if the federal government was procuring the system, they would have to do a privacy impact assessment because that was part of federal law beginning in 2002. But because they were letting the money out to the states in block grants, and the money could only be used for infrastructure, it couldn't be used to hire more police or to do different sorts of service work. It had to be used for infrastructure. They weren't attaching that as a contract provision. And I almost got that done, but happy to talk offline if you want to know why it didn't happen. But then I had the game had to move to the local level. And if you look now, there are cities like Oakland and others that are standing up surveillance ordinances and putting together boards of community representatives to review and provide advice to make sure that technology that's being procured for use that is considered surveillance technology, which can be a broad range of things, right? It can be the smart parking meters that are all of a sudden collecting a lot of data, because doing the same function in a new way is no longer the same function, right? It has really different implications for how, again, as Fabian was pointing out, how does that technology feed into the carceral state, right? What sort of data is it producing, and how might it be repurposed, reused, etc.? How does it change who can see whom and kind of at what cost? And so now you have this happening at the local level, and I think that's really super important. But we now have kind of all of these discrete efforts, and there's a need to try to make sure everybody is learning from one another, everybody isn't kind of evaluating the same system over and over again. Right, so I really do think that there's a need for more shared resources, and to me, places like the US Digital Services, right, we've seen them do this around web design, right, to develop templates and tools that help agencies that are not experts, for example, on AI, but are experts in their subject matter area, and they need to understand what are the questions they should be asking about these systems, or what are the design considerations. And I think shared resources can help us do that. And that could also be sharing impact assessments that one community's done with another, etc.
Thank you so much, Deirdre. And that is actually a great cue to wrap because we are at time. Sharing resources and building community is what we want to do next and what we set out to do with this project. So I'm going to put the link to the site back into the chat where you can download the primer, and you can also sign up for a little Google group where we hope that the kinds of questions that folks have asked in the Q&A and the themes that were discussed among our great panelists today will be asked and shared. And hopefully we will create a community that gets more literate and equitable around issues of AR and procurement. And we can build on the years of work that has already been done on this by activists and academics. And other folks. And thank you so much, everybody. Deirdre Mulligan, Fabian Rogers, Adrianna Tan for joining us. Rumman, thank you for being co-captain. John Havens and Alpesh from IEEE, thank you for that. Team in the background, Janina Zakshevsky, again, who's done great work. Anna Gressel deserves a shout out as well, who's done wonderful work. And all those folks who helped us put this together. And hopefully everybody, we can stay in touch. Take good care of yourselves. Have a wonderful week, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.